Thank you, Mikkel. And hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. I am coming from New York, so it's always a pleasure to be in Europe and specifically in Paris. As you just heard, I'm a senior analyst at Forrester Research, serving our executive clients. I lead the firm's research on consumer behavior and decision making. So in this presentation, what I'm going to do is really two things. One is I'd like to share the latest data from our firm that adds some quantitative rigor to the stories we've been telling so far and to this idea of purpose and a values-driven company. And two, I'm going to share a variety of brand examples from companies that have moved from talking about values to actually acting on their values and showing their values in the customer experience. So we've heard so far quite a lot of fascinating and invaluable historical context. And I'd like to add to that by noting that decades, centuries ago, it was very, very difficult for people to predict the speed and reach and growth of technology. And because of this exponential explosion of technology, there are a couple of things that make this particular moment in history unique or unprecedented. First, as people are becoming more sensitive to company values, they're also more vocal about these values. We've seen across social media sites that the volume of consumer-generated conversation about company values has more than doubled in the past year alone. So there's this tremendous crescendo of voices that is now impossible for business leaders and for companies to ignore. These sensitive values, or these sensitive consumers, thanks to technology, now have unprecedented access into once hidden information. Consumers are able to use their skills to search on the internet, search rating and review sites, look at live video streams to gain access into company practices in ways they have never done before. Consumers can now even see how managers are treating their employees, like in the video of the Uber CEO criticizing a company, an Uber driver that went viral a couple of years ago. And consumers are now passionate and coordinated enough to drive change in major organizations. Not necessarily gradually over time, but sometimes even in a matter of days. It took one young girl in the small town in Mississippi just a matter of weeks to launch a petition online, gather enough momentum and press, and pressure Gatorade to drop a potentially harmful ingredient from one of its products. And these things happen all the time. It's because of petitions like this that teenage magazines no longer Photoshop their models, or this is why many of the major banks in the US have dropped their monthly debit card fees. So with all of this happening in this particular moment, where does it leave you? Where does it leave the business and technology decision maker? If I had to pick a kind of metaphor to describe what this looks like or what this means in the decision-making business context today, this is what I would choose. It's sort of like we're all in this, open boat on a raging ocean in the middle of a storm with the clouds sort of brewing in the near distance and whipping up these waves. And in this particular moment, the captain of the boat would be gripping the wheel, right, bracing for these merciless winds. And the question in this particular time is, will the captain steer the boat, or will the boat steer the captain? And it might sound or look or feel dramatic, but when we think that this is really where businesses are today when it comes to making core decisions on their values, it's not so exaggerated. You all, the business and the technology decision makers, are the captain, and you're steering customers through the world of your brand. And there are increasingly strong tailwinds that are urging you to take a stand on your values, pick a side, show your values and show your commitment to these values over time. These tailwinds are coming from consumers, as we've talked about already, who are losing trust in things like their sports teams or the media or the government, things that they've typically used to reflect their values, to create a sense of community. Now they're redirecting that trust into brands. Today, 47% of consumers in France, specifically, say they prefer to buy from companies that stand for the causes they believe in. Over 6 in 10 French consumers prefer buying products that are environmentally friendly, that are made locally, and a majority of consumers in the UK and in France say that companies should focus on improving local communities. They're looking for businesses to play a greater role in their local community. This pressure is also coming from employees, not just consumers. Employees are now expecting that their employer stick to certain values, show their values code. And now employees are also coordinated and passionate enough to retaliate when the employer doesn't adhere to those particular values. We've seen this in the past with companies like Google, where the employees staged a walkout in protest of certain decisions that the brand had made. Today, even though the majority of employees say they agree with the core values of their company, only 50% say that their company actually helps them live their values. So it's still sort of a 50-50 chance as to whether your employee feels like he can follow through on their values in the workplace. And finally, this urgency also comes from investors and shareholders, like Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, one of the largest investment firms in the world, who is urging CEOs to demonstrate a commitment to the communities where they operate, to think about issues central to the world's future prosperity. Even with this urgency from investors and shareholders, only about 55% of employees in France say that their managers actually live the company values. They feel as though management is personally demonstrating these company values. So there's a huge gap between what the market is looking for and what, in reality, executives are able to deliver on. One of the reasons it's very, very difficult to actually take action is that it's extremely hard to correlate this action to business outcomes. So, for instance, Chick-fil-A is a fast food company based in the US. Now it's coming over to Europe. And this company is known for having extremely conservative values. And a few years ago, when the management expressed these values and showed a commitment to these conservative values, it sparked enormous controversy. On one hand, the conservatives were applauding the brand. On the other hand, liberals were rioting and criticizing the brand, picketing in front of the store locations. This, by the way, is now happening in London. Just a few weeks ago, when the store opened their first location there, the same kind of riots rose up. But what happened to the business? It turns out that because of this particular stand on values, because of management being open and honest about their values, within a matter of hours, the company broke one-day sales records. By the next year, total sales were up 12%. And so this was an example of the captain being in control, right? Steering the boat and making a very calculated, successful business choice. On the other hand, Papa John's is a fast food pizza delivery company, sort of similar in the same space, that also has very conservative values. And here again, the management made this very public, and it led to enormous controversy. The conservatives were applauding the company, the liberals were criticizing the company. But here, what happened to the business? In a matter of a few months, by the next quarter, total sales were down 4%. Papa John's ended its partnership with the National Football League and other sports organizations in the US, and the CEO had to step down. In this case, the boat was steering the captain. The decisions that were made were not driven by the business. So it's very, very hard to cross these unforgiving waters, but you have to do so. And it's very difficult to know whether what you're saying about your values and how you're saying it is leading you towards solid ground or wayward into the storm. And for this reason, we're finding that companies either aren't taking action at all, or they are taking action and are very often missing the mark. 78% of global CEOs say that they feel like their business is failing to deliver on its social pledge. So even though they've made the promise, 78% of those executives say that they're failing to actually follow through or take action on the promise that they've been talking about. And what this leads to is only 53% of firms globally really feel like what they're doing through their customer experience is showing empathy for the customer. They're able to connect on this emotional level. So in this particular environment, you have to take a stand on your values, right? This is sort of how the winds are pushing you in this particular direction. But the only way that you will stay in control and safely guide your ship to the intended destination is by looking at what's going on below the surface. It seems very complicated because we're quick to talk about the turmoil and the chaos that happens sort of at a superficial level or at the surface level. But when we really go beneath that, when we go deep to understand the emotions that are driving people, when we try to see the order beneath the chaos, then we can figure out how to say the right things to really resonate with people and solve the root cause, address these the root need. So this is the kind of research that my team has embarked on over the past few years. We looked at hundreds of thousands of global consumer surveys. We conducted virtual focus groups with consumers around the world. We looked at behavioral data. We looked at social media data. And then we applied our advanced analytics on top of that. And we looked at using all this data to, as I said, get deep and understand the emotional undercurrents that are driving behavior, driving attitude, and setting expectation. And we wanted to see why exactly are people so vocal about companies taking a stand on values. What is it that they're really looking for? How can we explain this behavior, and how can we meet that behavior? And it turns out that when we get to this level, we find three key reasons that explain why people are demanding these values-based companies. And these reasons are very, very human. They are fundamental to all of our decisions, to our actions every day. These are things that we all share in common. They're right here with us in this room, even though they're often invisible to us, or there are things that we rarely talk about or acknowledge. So I'll take you through these three reasons, and I'll show you some examples of brands that have created values-based experiences that solve these particular underlying emotional needs. So the first reason is that people are craving an emotional connection in a digital world. So for years, and we've talked about this already, people have been struggling to balance the isolating effects of technology with this sense of connection. And today, with almost infinite digital touch points, digital channels, that thirst for human-to-human connection is more apparent than it has been before. This is why we're starting to see robots with faces and personalities that are making sounds that sort of mimic the human, aesthetic or the human condition. This, for example, is Curry, who is a robot that was launched at the Consumer Electronics Show recently, and his claim to fame was being the cutest robot in the world. So we're even ascribing things like cute, right? These human descriptives to our technologies and to our brands. Consumers are looking for brands and technologies to solve this need for the human connection by being emotional, by showing some kind of personality, which is why Philips took a very interesting stand to show that they are a company that sells more than devices and technologies. They wanted to show that they are actually using these products to help people have a better life. So Philips got consumers together who are suffering from a lung disease and basically helped them to speak again and to eventually sing again. And through a short series of films, the company shows the journey of these individuals using, of course, the Philips technologies to overcome their illnesses and to develop the strength to sing in a choir. They call it the breathless choir. And this group eventually ended up performing in legendary theaters all over the world. So this kind of thing shows that the brand cares, right? It's tugging at people's emotions. It humanizes the brand and the product experience. And when consumers experience this kind of thing, they say, I feel better when I find a company that stands for these good causes. I feel happy doing business with them in any way that I can. So putting emotion at the forefront of the experience of the design is critical because of this need for this emotional human-to-human connection. But humanizing the brand is not just about having a rich emotional experience. It's also about showing that people care. Right, so we talked about this yesterday. Some points were made that when we're in times of distress, our saving grace is reminding ourselves of what makes us human. And that can be setting goals, that can be about creativity. I would also add that it's about showing that we care, right? Computers will never give a damn, right? Algorithms will just never care, but it's something that humans can uniquely do. And in this particular moment in time, this is exactly what people are looking for. And this is why they are looking to buy from companies that stand for certain values. 55% of French consumers say that they admit that they buy products to let people see what their values are. Right, so buying from values-based companies is an exercise in identity creation, in showing what people care about and care for. So Pnc Bank is a financial firm based in the US that has taken this to heart, and it basically infuses this idea of sustainability and green thinking in everything from the design of the office space. It became, at the time of this move, the greenest building in Pittsburgh, where it's headquartered, to the role that it plays in the community, creating green spaces in the cities and allowing people to have these moments where they can sit and spend time with these green walls and sort of things like that. And it turns out that Pnc Bank offers one of the best customer experiences across the board. So we study the quality of a customer experience across hundreds of brands every year. And Pnc Bank has emerged as one of the top customer experiences, not just in financial services, but even when you look at the best experiences in travel or retail or insurance or media. And it's because the brand takes a stand on the values and infuses it throughout the experience and plays a role in the community so that it feels like a local participant, creates this sense of community and this sense of identity. Consumers not only are staying with the brand, Pnc has some of the highest loyalty scores in the financial industry, but they're also saying things like when they buy from these kinds of brands, it gives them a sense of solidarity. Third, and finally, people demand values-based companies because they're searching for meaning. And I don't mean this as some sort of abstract spiritual quest. I mean meaning as something that is very real, this deep-seated, fundamental, evolutionary force that we are acting upon every single day. We are trying to maximize moments of meaning in everything, from the movies we choose to watch to the brands that we choose to follow. And we find that we have moments of meaning successfully when any of 5 things happen. Values are part of every single one of these 5 things. And conveniently, we can use this acronym MEANS to remember the 5 components of a meaningful experience. So I'll take you through each one of these very quickly. The first one is morality. We have a meaningful experience when we see our moral code reflected in the world around us. Last year, Disney donated $100 million to build theaters inside of children's hospitals so that these young patients could forget their conditions, forget their illnesses for a couple of hours and indulge in some, pure entertainment. Pathé Films is doing the same thing here in Europe. So if you hear the story and you sort of get that, warm, happy feeling, it's because you're observing a company that is doing something, quote unquote, good, right? Doing something right. You're observing this moral beauty. The second is engagement. We have a meaningful experience when we take action, when we do something related to our values. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have ever run a marathon? Okay, just about a handful. How many of you have gone mountain climbing? Quite a lot of you. How many of you have gone skydiving? I'm just curious. Quite a few. Okay, so I have never run a marathon. I have been mountain climbing and I've been skydiving off of this particular mountain, which is the Jungfrau Peak in the Swiss Alps. But why do we do it? Right? Why do we put ourselves through hours and hours of grueling training? Why do we take risks like jumping out of a plane 14,000 feet in the air? It's because we need to take this action. We need to show that we are committed to something. And it's by taking action that we have this sense, we realize this sense of meaning. The same thing applies to brands. In France, particularly this brand, C'est qui le patron, is an example of a company that started a website that let consumers vote on the ingredients they wanted in their particular products and the price they would pay for these products. And it's through this crowdsourcing exercise that the company came up with a new kind of milk that was created from organically fed cows and had very specific ingredients. And even though this particular product was priced higher than the average milk on the market, within 2 years it sold 100 million liters, which is more than 5% of the French market. So for consumers, buying this milk isn't just going to the store and buying a staple ingredient. They are taking a stand. They are showing that they're contributing to something that is larger than themselves. The next one is awareness. We have a meaningful experience when something broadens or deepens our awareness. One example of a brand that does this really well is Everlane, which has embraced an idea of radical transparency, where they show very clearly on their website who are the people behind the craftsmanship of all of their products. What is the path that the product takes along the supply chain until it reaches the consumer's hands? For the consumer, seeing this information, learning about this, makes the product all that more valuable when they finally make the purchase. Network. We find meaning when we feel connected to a community or a tribe or others that are associated with the same values that we care about. Marks & Spencer is the high street UK retailer that has a really interesting example of this because they invite their employees and their customers to come together, pick up a paintbrush or a shovel and rebuild their local communities. What I love about this example is this sense of network or community is very physical. It's not, doesn't only exist in the digital world, and it allows employees and consumers to create the bond together. So it doesn't have to be a community among consumers or just among employees. You can think about the entire ecosystem of the business. Finally, satisfaction. We find meaning when something reinforces or validates our satisfaction, tells us that we made the right choice. 10 Tree Apparel is a brand that has the goal of planting 1 billion trees around the world by the year 2030. So for every product sold, 10 trees are planted. And the consumer gets a unique code to register with the company's app that allows them to track the trees over time and see where they're planted. So this is great because the experience doesn't end with the transaction or with the actual product. The experience ends with seeing that your trees are being planted and are flourishing over time. So at this point, you might be thinking, these are really nice sort of feel-good stories, but in my company, in my industry, our corporate social responsibility has us covered. We have our mottos on the wall. We can sort of check the box. But what I'll say is that when meaning becomes part of the business strategy, when it becomes something you incorporate that's at the center of the business, it becomes the means to prosperity. Businesses become meaning makers. They help consumers build this identity, help them have this emotional connection. When businesses know and own their own values. And this takes some hard self-reflection. You might have values already built into your company today. You might have to create them. You might have to find them. You may even have them on the back burner. So values that have been part of the origin story that have been lost over time. But companies that do take a stand on these values and reinforce these values over time set themselves up for longer-term success. These companies are more likely to expect stronger relationships in the next 5 years and expect to become the most innovative in their category. One example of a brand that we don't typically think of as being social is Cadbury, right? We don't think of this necessarily as a social impact company, but the brand was started with the goal of building housing for factory workers and improving the lives of its employees. So again, you might have this in the history of the brand, and it's a matter of bringing that forward. Once you know your values, it's important to create the values-oriented experience for your employees first, and for customers second. Because we're finding that values are increasingly important to the employee experience. 85% of employees that agree with their company values are more likely to be productive at work compared to just 72% of employees on average. 87% of these employees are more likely to stay with their employer, and 71% become advocates. They recommend their own companies, brands, and products. Warby Parker is a company that we all know to be a social brand, but the founders discovered that consumers buy Warby Parker glasses, number 1, for style, number 2, for price, and number 3, because of the social mission. But the social mission is the number 1 reason why employees come to work every day. So the company is very overt about the values and the social mission internally in the office and sort of buries it in consumer-facing marketing material. And finally, when you're creating these values-based experiences for any stakeholder, for your consumer, your employee, your partner, your investor, make sure that you're thinking about how this experience conveys what your brand means, right? Ask yourself, is this reflection of our values really just talking about it and making a promise, or does it reflect the morality? Does it require participation or engagement? Does it teach some sort of awareness? Does it create a sense of community or network? And does it reinforce satisfaction? Because the companies that become meaning makers, become a vehicle for meaning, are more likely to offer a top-tier customer experience and are more likely to report out double-digit year-on-year revenue growth. So you have to take a stand at a certain point, but when you do, you want to make sure that your point of view is creating meaning for both your stakeholders and for the business, that those two things are aligned. And this means plugging into the moods, emotions, risk sensitivities of your stakeholders, of your customers, to understand how they're investing their time and their money. And it means that by having this understanding, you can lock in customer and employee loyalty. With that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anjali. So I already saw that there's an interesting question, which is it's really about this purpose washing. So because this generation also have a very good radar for the lack of authenticity. And so what's the risk when you try to create something like 10 trees, your example, when they say, okay, for every 10 items you buy, we plant a tree or something like that, but at the same time, they have children in Bangladesh of 8-year-old sewing their clothes.
Yeah.
So how do you create a real authenticity there?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and the challenge or the complexity is there's always going to be variation in terms of what people look at and what they're sensitive to. And so there really is no way to be neutral anymore. There's no way to pick a value really that's neutral. Even things that used to be safe space or neutral in the past are now contentious or now polarizing. And so the way to develop this authenticity is first to know yourself, right? Know the values. It starts internally, know the values that you stand for. Then externally look at where is the overlap between your values and the values of the customers that are most important to your business. And then the third piece is to not just talk, but then take action. So using that means framework as an example, right? Showing that these values are manifested in the customer experience. It's infused in the employee experience, in your product, in how you're engaging with customers in a variety of contexts. It's not just the marketing material.
And that's also the response to when you have a campaign, a shaming campaign against what you're doing. That's the way how you have to respond.
Right, exactly. And it's showing that consistency over time. And I'll also mention that we found that, on this topic of authenticity, brands that report out on their intentions are already setting themselves up for success. So consumers are responsive to brands that say, this is our goal, and it'll take us 5 years, 10 years to work towards this. And even if they miss their goal or they miss the mark, at least being open about that
transparency
helps drive this authenticity.
Okay. I have another question. So what you explained in your story is that technology is becoming emotional, right? It's becoming part of your product, or at least part of the experience that you as a company are creating. Now, I know a lot of technologists. I meet them every day, and their strength is not empathy and compassion usually. So, what is it? What's your advice? Should we take our technologists and try to train them in compassion and empathy, in those more emotional values of technology, or should we hire more, let's call them emotion experts into our teams, behavioral economists, sociologists, psychologists? What works? What have you seen?
Yeah, so I think the irony is that human beings are hardwired to be empathetic. We are naturally, you can't control this visceral emotional experience, but it's about, having the proximity to the customer. So if you see your customer struggling with something, you will inherently feel some kind of emotional response to that. So I think, before bringing in additional talent, it's important to bring your employees wherever they are in the organization, even if they're coding or they're never on the front lines, they're sort of in the backs of behind the scenes of the business. Bring them to the forefront and let them listen to the customer conversations, watch what customers are doing. Having that closeness just naturally sort of creates this moment of clarity for those individuals, and it's just you're fundamentally, as a human being, you can't ignore that sort of sense. But it's about listening, it's about acknowledging that listening, it's about having that closer connection.
So it's this observation as part of discovery skills that you say that organizations need to develop.
That empathy, yeah.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure,
Thank you.